since 4 years, and since the recent declaration of the September 11 and September 15, I have not seen any change from the position of the communists. But on the contrary, I have that their newest position is more vicious, is more stubborn than ever.
For Saigon, like Jakarta, is a vigorous and expanding city with elegant new buildings, hotels, flats and office blocks, which reflect the steadily growing importance in the world of the capital city of Vietnam.
từ vào đời Việt Nam hai câu nói trên cánh đồi Việt Nam nước tôi Việt Nam tên gọi là người Việt Nam hai câu nói sau cùng khi lìa đời Việt Nam.
One does not expect to see much evidence in Saigon that the country is nearer to peace than at any time since the Long War began. A generation of fighting has made the Vietnamese pessimists. If there is an absence of excitement about the prospect of peace, there is much evidence that the government here is preparing for the event. All this week, thousands of hastily prepared posters have been pasted up on the city buildings. And for the first time in 4 years, since the last peace talks in fact, flags are being sold on the streets as part of the pro-Thieu, pro-loyalist, pro-war campaign. People are expected to display them prominently. Other banners up today endorse President Thieu's demand for a referendum on whether the people want any communist participation in a Saigon government. A referendum under the present law is of course nonsense. To endorse communism by word or by vote is punishable by death. Thieu's propaganda is no less effective than Hanoi's. So it's not surprising that when you stop people in the streets, their arguments tend to be identical. It's simply that if Hanoi really wants peace, it has only to turn around and walk out of South Vietnam. Back up its promise of a ceasefire, they say, by taking its 13 divisions out of the country. Hanoi, they say, is proposing peace terms very favorable to itself in a war that it's far from winning. Left to his own opinion and that of his military advisers, President Thieu can be expected to reject out of hand any new Hanoi proposal. But we know, of course, that any decision which directly involves Washington is not made on his own. If he continues blocking the peace proposals, President Thieu runs the risk of alienating Washington and President Nixon, who can argue in his own terms that he's ended the war and that from then on his responsibility ends. But President Thieu has warned Washington many times this week that a withdrawal of American support here could lead to a bloodshed. It could lead to a spate of intensive Viet Cong activity here in Saigon. It could lead to massive defection in the army, even an attempted coup. And this President Thieu knows the Americans cannot afford, however attractive Hanoi makes its proposals. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, Saigon. What kind of peace will come to South Vietnam? How long will it last? How long will it take the communists to recapture politically all they have lost in the fighting of the war? There's an easy glib answer in Saigon. It all depends, they say, on the staying power of the dollar after the Americans have pulled out. President Thieu, these people and their country's economy will depend on the dollar as much in peacetime as they did in the war. It's argued that the only way to prevent the communists' rise to power in the promised peacetime elections is to continue to pour more American money into South Vietnam. It's been estimated that this country depends 85% on American aid. and it shows. Saigon, despite the long war, now seems to be booming. The marketplaces are full, and as Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, approaches, people are buying at such a rate that already spending records have been broken. So an improved standard of living dependent on increased American aid. As one American advisor said, "We've made the towns and cities safe from communism." He meant, of course, the dollar, and he may be right. But the biggest risk to peace is in the countryside where the war is. This is a Michelin rubber plantation 40 miles northwest of Saigon. The area is dominated by the communists, and these people running from one village to the safety of another represents the other South Vietnam. They, like us that morning, had been caught in between fire as the North Vietnamese were trying to hit with rockets a bridge connecting the South Vietnamese fire post to their main supply route to Saigon. The people in the countryside know nothing of the consumer boom. They bear the brunt of the fighting. Their families are sometimes killed accidentally as American and South Vietnamese aircraft bomb communist positions. They have spent most of their lives as refugees, a great deal of the time living in what the military call free fire zones, an area where no civilian authority is needed before an artillery or air bombardment is launched. It is these people the communists will rely on for political support in the peace. It was their sons who were recruited as Viet Cong, and they provided food and shelter to the guerrillas. As the wounded of this fight waited in the dust and sun to be airlifted out to a hospital in Saigon, what was left of their company were taken by helicopter to new combat positions on the other side of the plantation 6 miles away. The war is slowing down, it seems. People are now preparing themselves for the political infighting that's soon about to begin. There are expected to be many casualties.
So despite the troops that are employed on the ground combat, despite the artillery, despite the airlifts, the communists continue to dominate much of the countryside, and they can be expected to do the same during peace. Much of the success of the peace settlement, much of the success of an independent South Vietnam will depend on how thoroughly, how cleverly the Viet Cong's National Liberation Front moves back across this countryside after the peace is declared, picking up their votes. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam.
Việt Nam nghe từ vào đời, Việt Nam hai câu nói trên cánh đồi. Việt Nam nước tôi, Việt Nam tên gọi là người. Việt Nam hai câu nói sau cùng khi lìa đời. Việt Nam linh hiền sinh tươi, Việt Nam đã vào sông núi, tự do không bình phạt ai muôn đời. Việt Nam không đòi xương máu, Việt Nam kêu gọi thương nhau, Việt Nam đi xây đất yên vui dài lâu. Việt Nam trên đường tương lai, lửa tiếng soi toàn thế giới, Việt Nam ta nguyện tranh đấu cho đời. Tình yêu đây là thế giới, tình thương kéo về muôn nơi, Việt Nam đây tiếng nói để xây nên người. Việt Nam, Việt Nam, Việt Nam quê hương đất nước xa vời. Việt Nam.
The South Vietnamese are now obsessed with flag raising. The 3 red stripes on the yellow background have been hoisted in their thousands this week, not only in Saigon, but in every village and every hamlet under loyalist control. Earlier, the flag had simply been a symbol of support for President Thieu and his opposition to the ceasefire terms. But now, as more and more people think the ceasefire is inevitable, flags issued by the government now establish those areas under its control. But there are still plenty of areas still in doubt. We came across this roadblock on Highway 1, the road that leads to Cambodia. The communists had taken the villages of Up Chu and Up Doc, only 15 miles from the outskirts of Saigon. and it's the nearest they've managed to come so far in 4 years. In the past 36 hours, there were more than 148 communists attacked throughout the south, more than at any time since the massive Tet offensive in 1968. There were also 81 shelling and rocket attacks. Most of the attacks have been around the Central Highlands, which is where President Chu has had to send many of his better divisions. And this is why a handful of snipers dug into bunkers have effectively cut Highway 1 in half. Michael Nicholson, ITN, Highway 1, South Vietnam.
In South Vietnam, the first step in the formation of a civilian democratic government is taken. Citizens turn out to elect a constituent assembly, whose job is to draft a new national constitution. Viet Cong terrorism killed 19 soldiers and civilians, and yet more than 4 million voters cast ballots, about 81% of those registered. For the 117-seat assembly, there are 530 candidates. It is hoped that the eventual election of a national legislature will solve the military and political struggle here. The long and difficult process of counting the votes goes on all night. The tremendous turnout at the polls is an important psychological victory over the Viet Cong. Premier Key's ruling military junta will continue to guide South Vietnam while the elected assembly creates the nation's new charter, a small but vital step toward popular government for this country.
Can I ask you how seriously you're taking this current communist offensive here?
Well, I intend to kill them all.
Is it a major offensive?
Oh, yes, major offensive. Yes, a 5th Division and the 9th Division.
How many men involved against you?
Well, we had, to begin with, we had the 5th Division, that's 3 regiments. And those regiments about 1,500 each. We had 3 regiments of the 5th Division at Loc Ninh, and then the 9th Division decided they wanted to take province headquarters at An Loc.
In military terms, is it just a diversionary move to keep troops down in the south while they maintain their attack in the north?
Well, I don't know. You gentlemen have been in business a long time. I always thought Saigon was the target.
It's evident that when the communists first planned this offensive, they didn't expect so many South Vietnamese to be massed against them so quickly. They came into the country this far south as a gesture, to show they can still come and go as they choose and destroy what they like when they decide to. But unless the North Vietnamese move out of those towns ahead within the next 24 hours, they may well find that the road back to their Cambodian base is now closed. It seems for the first time in this war that the South Vietnamese are now calling the tune. And the military commanders here are seeing this just not as a counter-offensive, but as a time to see for the first time, one way or the other, whether the South Vietnamese, without the aid of the Americans on the ground, can compete with the North Vietnamese on their own terms. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, South Vietnam. In this one cemetery alone in Saigon, more than 65 coffins were awaiting burial on the morning we filmed there. The South Vietnamese casualties in this war are much, much higher than the American casualties of 1968 and 69. Higher because they are fighting a less sophisticated war without the all-embracing air cover the American troops demanded. The defense of Highway 13, probably the most famous road in South Vietnam now, has taken many lives. A small but crucial highway, it is the one that brings supplies from the docks in Saigon to the troops up front. It is the one the communists would have to control if they were to try and take Saigon. Locally recruited militia, called Popular Forces, are stationed in and around villages which border the road, protecting, we are told, the people from attack or intimidation by the Viet Cong. Because so many of the young men are now in the army, the recruits are usually old men or young girls. They are given a week's training in firearms, a black uniform, and then they're on their own. The South Vietnamese attempts to clear Highway 13 are often indiscriminate. Their artillery destroyed part of a village just south of the base at Lai Khe. It was a mistake. Their map coordinates were wrong. But 8 people died, including a family of 5, and 20 more people were injured. In the past few days, a handful of communist snipers have been successful in keeping Highway 13 closed more often than it's open. This queue of lorries, cars and coaches have been waiting to get through to Chon Tan for the past 30 hours. Further on, about another 2 miles, we were caught in a sniper ambush, despite being part of a large army convoy on its way with supplies to Chon Tan. We watched as the local commander called in artillery fire. And after that had cleared some of the forest, he called in phantom jets piloted by Americans, who began low-level bombing runs, dropping napalm. Then the infantry went into the forest to count the VC dead. They found none. Somehow they had escaped it all and had retreated deeper into the jungle without waiting too long for the South Vietnamese troops to make contact on any scale. But the South Vietnamese again took casualties, hit by an enemy they seldom ever see, in an area supposedly under South Vietnamese control. Maybe tonight, or maybe tomorrow morning, that same communist company will attack again somewhere, up or down this Highway 13. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, South Vietnam.